I'm thrilled to be here with you today to talk about Martha Washington, everything that we think we know about her, everything that we should know about her as well. So we probably often think about Martha Washington because she was the first lady of the United States, the wife of George Washington. But what we might not know about her is that long after her death, she really became an icon of American womanhood. She became kind of the ideal representation of what a woman should be for many people in the United States. When we think of her, we probably often think of this portrait of her as an older woman. This is one that's in the National Portrait Gallery. It's also owned by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And this is a portrait of her that she actually didn't like. This is a portrait that was, as you know, created by a famous American artist, but one that has become popular in the 21st century in a way that it was never popular during her actual lifetime. In fact, many people were much more familiar with her as this young woman. This is a portrait done in 1757 that was reproduced widely numerous times during her lifetime. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Let's find out more about her as a woman during her lifetime. So she was actually born in 1731. This is a period when colonists are certainly thinking about the ways that they are unhappy with their British rulers, but they are not thinking about rebellion. They are not, Martha Washington isn't growing up imagining a world in which she could be a leader in a new nation. She was born in Virginia. She was a part of an elite Southern family, and her education as a young woman primarily consisted of learning how to be a hospitable wife. And we may not really consider that to be a good education today, but at the time, that was something that was considered to be incredibly valuable for a woman of her status. And as we know, it became incredibly valuable for a woman who became the first lady and really cultivated that role into the position that we know it as today. So, as a young woman, she was learning how to become a grand hostess, and she eventually married her first husband in 1749, Daniel Parke Custis. Now, Daniel Parke Custis was older than her. As may have been the case for many young women at the time. And they had children together. And this is a portrait. They actually had a series of portraits of their family done in 1757. There's a pair portrait of her husband as well here. Unfortunately, that very same year, Custis died, and that left Martha Custis at the time, as a woman who was a widow with children. And also because Custis actually left her all of his property, all of his money, all of the people that he had enslaved, she was also an extraordinarily wealthy young woman. And the other thing to really keep in mind about the status of widows in early colonial America is that they also had a significant amount of power. So while she was a married woman, her husband had the legal power to make decisions for her. However, as a widow, she could actually sign legal documents, and she could control her wealth and control a lot more about her life than she could with a husband. So in fact, there are a lot of cases where widows actually decided to stay widowed because they could have so much more independence. However, Martha decided, as we all know, to marry George Washington. By this point, George Washington, he had early stumbles with the British Army, initially kind of lost a battle that really led to the French and Indian War early on. So kind of infamous at first, won a little bit more fame later. So by this time, he is a relatively well-known military figure in the British Army, but certainly not the kind of figure that we think of him today. But he saw in Martha the opportunity to become a very wealthy figure. He had not grown up with significant wealth and power. He also saw an opportunity to retire from the military because he could become a landowner, someone who is managing his estate, which of course at the time was Martha's estate. And they did become married in 1759. And at that point, Martha Washington did transfer all of her wealth over to George Washington. And this really was pivotal in turning him into the kind of prominent, powerful figure in Virginia that he became. So the marriage to Martha Washington is really something that created the basis for his platform to kind of launch himself as a really prominent figure politically in the American colonies. And so a few things to think about here. So Martha Washington is a local wife, a private citizen. She's caring for her children. This kind of portrait probably stayed in their family home, which was outside of Washington, D.C., and still is available for you to visit outside of Washington, D.C. And she is starting to, as the United States, as the future United States goes towards war, she is starting to gain attention because George Washington decides to go to Philadelphia and appeal to the politicians who are leading the call for revolution. He throws on his old British military outfit, even though it's a little tight, and he convinces them that he should lead this new Continental Army. And as part of his new prominence, his new power, his new position, Martha Washington, of course, also gains a similar type of prominence. And so actually, in addition to these portraits, these painted portraits, the one we were just looking at, which is very limited circulation, only people who can see that portrait are the people who come literally into your home, perhaps, and see the painting. These prints circulated much more widely. Right? So we have George Washington on one side, represented as a military leader. There's fire in the background. There's a military drum. He has a sword. He's standing, looking ready to fight. In contrast, we have this portrait of Martha Washington kind of tending her home at the fireplace. In the background, this idyllic pastoral landscape, really showing the expectations for what this leader is supposed to be doing during this crisis versus what his wife is supposed to be doing during this crisis. What we actually know is that Martha Washington traveled with her husband fairly regularly throughout the war. She didn't stay in the camps. She stayed in homes nearby, typically, much nicer quarters. But she did a lot of work to help make sure that Washington felt really supported while he was away. So she is really one of the few women to have her portrait being distributed to anyone in the colonies at that time. More often, there were representations of men, male political leaders, military figures, etc., like George Washington, that were being distributed very widely at that moment. So as we know that the United States became a nation, and we also know that George Washington became the first president, which means that Martha Washington became a new figure, a new important leading figure in the country. But the title of First Lady actually was not created until long after she held that role. Martha Washington is the first one to really create that role, but the name came later. So they decided to go to start this new capital city. Lady Washington, as she is titled here, followed her husband, and as she traveled to go meet him, she wore a brown hand-dyed homespun dress, a very plain dress. And the idea was that she wanted to make sure that Americans realized that she was not a queen. She was not going to be walking around with jewels, with a crown. And in fact, she didn't love this title, Lady Washington. She wanted people to realize that this was not a monarchy. This was not like those, the kind of like British traditional systems that they had just rebelled against. They were creating a new version of American politics.